Have you ever returned to a place that once felt familiar, only to find you no longer recognize it? That was the feeling Michael Carter had, the founder of a bakery that was once the heart of the neighborhood. One early morning, he came back to his shop after years away. The warm smiles were gone. The doughnut he once perfected now tasted bland and felt like stone. And the most painful part, the very people he trusted most were quietly tearing it all down. But Michael didn't get angry. He made a plan. This isn't just a story about a bakery, it's about honor, memory, and the quiet power of kindness. On an early morning, before the sun had a chance to warm the streets, the city was still silent. A man stood quietly across the road, holding a coffee he had hastily picked up from the corner shop. He stood there, eyes fixed on Sweet Bloom Bakery, the place he had spent nearly half his life building, yet now felt like a stranger to. Michael Carter, nearly 60, with neatly trimmed silver hair and a worn wool coat. No one recognized him as the founder of Sweet Bloom, a once beloved bakery praised in the local press for its warmth and traditional flavors. But after 3 consecutive quarters of losses and a string of customer complaints, known to him only as numbers on a report, Michael decided to do something he had never done before. Return to his bakery in the guise of an ordinary customer. No logo, no introduction, no name, just an older man, slightly hunched, looking to buy a donut for breakfast. As the glass door swung open and the familiar chime rang out, Michael stepped into the bakery like a stranger. No one recognized him. The cashier, a young man named Dylan, gave a faint, half-hearted smile. Not the kind of service Michael used to train his staff to give. "Chocolate donut and a black coffee, please," Michael said. "$4.75, Dylan replied, not bothering to ask anything more. Michael was slightly taken aback. That combo used to be $3. He nodded, handed over the money, and sat at the table by the window, the exact spot where his mother used to sit, counting orders. The donut looked the same as before, evenly round with a glossy chocolate glaze, but the moment he took a bite, his face tightened. The dough was dense, the filling was dry, and the chocolate, no longer the imported Belgian kind, was now cheap and harshly bitter. He set the donut down, eyes still fixed on the counter. Just then, 2 men walked out from the back. Michael recognized them immediately. Mark and Stephen, the 2 managers he had once trusted to run the shop. "Another slow morning," Mark whispered. "At this rate, that old man will have to sell it to us soon." "Relax," Stephen sneered. "He has no idea we switched suppliers, raised prices, and cut ingredients. He still thinks it's the economy." Michael froze. Their words were light as air but hit like a sledgehammer. They were plotting to sabotage the bakery. Not just lowering the quality, but deliberately running it into the ground so they could snatch it back at a bargain. Michael didn't need to hear more. He knew this wasn't the moment to lash out. As a former attorney who once handled corporate fraud cases, he understood one thing well. If you want a clean finish, you need solid evidence. As Michael stepped out of the bakery that day, the sun had finally broken through. He took a deep breath. The cold air filled his lungs, leaving him more clear-headed than ever. What filled his mind wasn't just the sting of betrayal, but the faces of longtime customers like Mrs. Gonzalez, who came every Sunday for a blueberry muffin, or young Josh, who had his first birthday party here and was now a college student. These were people who didn't just buy pastries, they had woven their memories and emotions into this place. Michael knew he couldn't let Sweet Bloom slowly die at the hands of a few greedy strangers. "This isn't just business," he told himself. "This is an honor. This is family. This is a community. You know, sometimes we think we still understand the place we built, only to realize we've been away from it for far too long." Michael once believed that managing through reports was enough, but he came to understand this. Nothing replaces being present. Nothing replaces a handshake, a smile, and a real conversation. If you're building something, a bakery, a brand, or even just a dream, remember this: always keep your heart close to it, and don't let anyone distort what you've poured yourself into. Michael Carter isn't giving up. And the story is only just beginning. Stay tuned for the next chapter, when a CEO becomes an ordinary man, quietly turning the tide. Returning home after a morning full of turmoil, Michael Carter sat quietly at his desk, holding a cup of tea gone cold. The words from Mark and Stephen still echoed in his mind, like voices bouncing off the walls of an empty room. Just a few more months and he'll have to sell. He doesn't know a thing, but he knew, and he was going to show them he wasn't the naive old man they thought he was. Michael began with what he knew best, checking the books. That entire night he went through every financial report, every pricing sheet, every line of inventory in and out. He had once been a lawyer specializing in corporate fraud, and he knew one thing for certain. If something shady was going on, the numbers would betray the guilty first. And they did. The ingredients purchased didn't match what was actually used. For example, in just 1 week, the system reported that 25 kilograms of imported chocolate had been used, but the inventory showed only 10 kilograms accounted for. 15 had vanished. And that was just the chocolate. Butter, eggs, vanilla, all showed the same suspicious patterns. He made notes on every detail, flagged every inconsistency. No shouting, no drama. Right now, all he needed was precision. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Michael returned to Sweet Bloom. Not as the owner. No tie, no blazer. Just an old man, quietly entering through the back door, using the spare key he had always kept for himself. He went through the cold storage, the kitchen, and the ingredient cabinets one by one. Everything appeared clean on the surface, but nothing could hide the truth from someone who knew every brick of this place. Cheap butter had replaced the high-quality French kind that Sweet Bloom once used. Low-grained flour came in unmarked sacks. Small details, perhaps, but they were the soul of the bakery. Sweet Bloom was once known for its quality and kindness, but now it was just a shell, a front for a scheme unfolding step by step. That day, Michael went to see Sarah, the longtime accountant, a woman who had been with him since the very beginning of Sweet Bloom. Sarah was still as meticulous, honest, and straightforward as ever. "Don't you think it's strange?" she asked when Michael raised his concerns. "Ingredient costs have skyrocketed, but profit reports haven't gone up. I asked Mark once, and he said it was part of a long-term strategy, but honestly, I never bought it." Sarah showed Michael the pricing increase approvals, all signed off by either Mark or Stephen. There was no indication that Michael had ever authorized any of the changes. They had even forged internal emails with his digital signature. Michael wasn't surprised, but he knew he was getting closer to the heart of the storm. That afternoon, Michael returned to the bakery, this time posing as a regular customer. He sat in a corner of the room, quietly observing. An elderly woman walked in. It was Mrs. Gonzalez, a loyal Sweet Bloom customer for over 20 years. "One blueberry muffin, like always," she said with a warm smile to the staff. $6.50, Stephen replied, not even looking at her. "Last week I only paid $4.75. That's the new price. Didn't you read the sign?" he snapped. Michael clenched his fists on the table. Mrs. Gonzalez, the same woman who had brought sweet pastries to his mother's funeral, was now being treated like a nuisance. A little later, Michael reconnected with Maggie, the elderly baker who had worked alongside his mother for years. Her face looked tired, and her calloused hands had lost their former passion. "I know. Something's going on," she whispered, but no one dares speak up. Anyone who says something gets their hours cut or pushed out. Back home, Michael opened his old notebook. On the very first page were his mother's handwritten words. "A bakery isn't just a place that sells food. It's a place where people are treated like family." He closed the notebook. Sweet Bloom wasn't falling apart because times had changed. It was crumbling because people had lost their way. Mark and Stephen thought he was old, tired, and had stepped off the stage. But they were wrong. Michael Carter had never left the game. He had simply been watching, and now he was preparing to strike back. To be continued. As the secrets lurking in the shadows begin to surface, the first trap is quietly set. A light rain was falling as Michael Carter stepped into a small cafe tucked away at the end of the street, just a few blocks from Sweet Bloom. He chose a table by the window and sat quietly, like an old man waiting for an old friend. But in truth, the first to arrive was Maggie, the baker who had been with his family for over 30 years. She sat down, removed her worn knit hat, and clutched her bag tightly, as if afraid someone might see her. "Thank you for coming, Maggie," Michael said gently. "Today I didn't ask you here for pastries, but for the truth." Maggie looked around before letting out a sigh. "I've kept this inside for far too long," she began, her voice trembling. "Ever since Mark and Stephen took over management, everything started changing. The ingredients were swapped for cheaper ones. Your mother's original recipes were altered. When I spoke up, Mark told me I should consider retiring early, because older people don't adapt well." She gave a faint, weary smile. "I stayed quiet, Michael, because I was afraid I had nowhere else to work. But when I saw Mrs. Gonzalez being charged double for the same muffin she used to eat every week, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." Michael gently squeezed her calloused hand. He said nothing, just nodded. He understood, and he didn't blame her. In fact, he was grateful. A few minutes later, Leo, the young man who worked at the front counter, quietly entered the cafe. He was still wearing his hoodie, hands in his pockets. "Thank you for coming," Michael said with a smile. "You don't have to be afraid." Leo sat down, glanced at Maggie as if seeking reassurance, then spoke softly. They trying to force you to sell the bakery, aren't they?" Michael was slightly taken aback. "How do you know that?" "I've overheard them talking a few times. One day, Mark bragged to Stephen that an investor was coming to review the books. I'm just a low-level employee, but I'm not blind. I can tell the pastries don't taste the same. Regular customers are disappearing. Everyone's afraid to speak up, and even the tip money isn't being shared fairly anymore." Leo's voice grew quieter, but his eyes stayed steady. He was young, but he carried a sense of integrity that made Michael believe, given the chance, this boy could one day become a true leader. Michael sat up straight, his voice low and steady. "They are deceiving me, yes. They want me to believe Sweet Bloom is failing so they can buy it back cheap, then change the name, the recipes, and erase the spirit my mother built into this place." He paused, looking directly into Maggie's and Leo's eyes. "But they forgot one thing. I'm not just some owner counting profits. I'm the son of the woman who once kneaded every batch of dough in the small kitchen behind that shop. And I won't let two opportunists destroy everything she built." What are we going to do?" Leo asked, his eyes shining with hope. "We're going to show them who truly understands Sweet Bloom." Michael began to put a plan into motion, gather internal evidence. Maggie and Leo would help him document everything they had witnessed: recipe changes, mistreatment of customers, tip abuse, pressure on staff to quit, and more. Install surveillance equipment. Michael contacted an old friend who had worked in corporate security. Discreet, compact cameras would be installed in the management office and near the cashier's area. Stage a fake investor meeting. Michael would arrange for a fake investor to approach Mark and Stephen, pretending to be interested in buying Sweet Bloom, drawing them into revealing their scheme. Reach out to former employees. Those who had been unfairly pushed out would be invited back to share what they knew, especially Karen, who lost her job simply for speaking up. Before they parted ways, Michael spoke softly. "I can't do this alone, but if we stand together, I believe Sweet Bloom can return to what it once was, or maybe even better." Maggie took his hand and squeezed it firmly. "I still remember what your mother said on my first day here. This place isn't just about making pastries, it's about making memories. I believe you'll hold on to that." Leo nodded. "Me too. I'll give it everything I've got." To be continued. The plan is set in motion. Mark and Stephen begin to walk into the trap, and Sweet Bloom enters its phase of quiet rebellion. It was a clear morning with a gentle breeze drifting through the quiet streets. Sweet Bloom Bakery opened as usual, but inside Michael Carter the air felt different. It was like the calm before a battle, the quiet moments before a well-laid chessboard comes to life. He no longer entered through the front door. A small back entrance, once used only by the bakers, had now become the silent gateway to his familiar battlefield. But this time, he wasn't wearing a thick coat or a cap to hide his face. Michael was stepping in as himself, and he was ready to reclaim everything. Last week, discreet surveillance cameras had been carefully installed, one in the manager's office, where Mark and Stephen often held private meetings, and another near the front counter, the area with the most customer interaction. Everything was connected to a private server that Michael had arranged. Video and audio, not a single detail was missed. Our old owner, Stephen, had once joked half seriously, "He's off somewhere, relaxing, left this place for us to run." What they didn't know was that the man they thought had disappeared was watching their every move, with the precision of a lawyer and the heart of a baker. On Wednesday afternoon, a well-dressed man walked into Sweet Bloom, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing dark sunglasses. He introduced himself as Robert Lin, a representative from an investment firm based in Singapore. His business card read, "Maple Grove Capital, reviving local brand." "I heard this bakery might be up for sale," he asked quietly, as if afraid someone might overhear. Stephen immediately shot a look at Mark, an opportunity. "We can talk privately if you'd like," Mark said with a smile, leading him to the back office. Meanwhile, at home, Michael opened his computer screen. The cameras had started recording the meeting, and each word spoken was like another brick in the case being built for betrayal. "We've been very strategic about it," Mark said, sliding a folder of documents toward Robert. "We cut ingredient costs, trimmed unnecessary staff, and adjusted prices to match the market." Stephen chimed in confidently. "The old owner doesn't really know what's going on. He thinks everything's gone downhill because of inflation. But really, we've been positioning the bakery for an easy transition." "And Mr. Carter suspects nothing?" Robert asked. Mark chuckled. "He trusts us like he trusts himself." At that exact moment, Michael clenched his fists, but he wasn't angry. He smiled. They had just confessed, and the camera was capturing every single word. Meanwhile, at the front counter, Leo quietly continued doing his equally important job rebuilding customer trust. He greeted each person by name, remembered their favorite pastries, and always smiled, even though he knew the system behind the scenes was falling apart. Little Emma, Mrs. Gonzalez's daughter, whispered to her mother, "Mom, the bakery feels like it used to again, doesn't it?" "Yes, sweetheart, something is coming back," she replied. In the kitchen, Maggie was quietly changing each batch of pastries. She secretly went back to Michael's mother's original recipes, removing the fake butter and industrial chocolate. She knew that if she were caught, she could lose her job. But she also knew this: if she didn't do it, there would be nothing left of Sweet Bloom worth saving. That evening, Michael met with Sarah, the bakery's former accountant. After several hours of cross-checking invoices and inventory records, they uncovered something suspicious. Ingredients were marked as used, but there were no corresponding orders. The shortages were no longer a coincidence, they were deliberate. And someone is definitely skimming supplies, Sarah concluded, and they're covering it up by faking production data. Michael nodded, his heart heavy but his mind clear. He had almost all the evidence he needed. The only thing missing was the final piece, a moment where Mark and Stephen would openly confirm their entire scheme. The next morning, Michael called Diana, a trusted lawyer who had once worked alongside him back in his corporate days. After listening to the full story, she said, "You've done everything right, but let them walk themselves off the cliff. I'll be there, right when it counts." Michael knew the tide was turning. A critical moment was approaching, and this time he wouldn't be watching from the sidelines. To be continued. Another investor meeting was about to take place, this time recorded. And Mark and Stephen had no idea that Michael Carter was right there in the room. That morning, the sky was still, the air crisp and clean, but Michael Carter's heart was anything but calm. Today would be the turning point. Every piece of the puzzle had been carefully prepared. Now, all that remained was to complete the picture. He put on a white dress shirt and his familiar gray coat, not to disguise himself but to return as the rightful owner. Standing in front of the mirror, he looked into his own eyes, calm but unshakable. They think I'm just a soft old man. Let's see who's the one trembling today. At 9 a.m. Sweet Bloom Bakery was running as usual, but inside a small meeting room everything was in place. A hidden camera had been switched on. The round table was cleared. On the wall hung a chart labeled Bakery Restructuring Plan, prepared by Mark himself, his way of impressing the potential investor. The door opened. Richard Michael's old friend, now playing the role of investor Aidan Cross, entered with a confident, professional demeanor. Alongside him was a woman in a black suit, serious and poised. It was Diana, Michael's lawyer, posing as the financial partner. Mark and Stephen beamed like they had just won the lottery. They eagerly offered drinks, pulled out chairs, and launched into their pitch like two men selling a dream. Sweet Bloom is a golden opportunity. We deliberately reduced sales performance to drive the value down, setting the stage for a low-cost buyout. Richard raised an eyebrow. You intentionally lowered performance to force a cheaper price. Stephen shrugged, smirking. Don't call it forcing, call it strategy. The old owner, Mr. Carter, doesn't really pay attention to this stuff anymore. He thinks things are going downhill because of the economy. They spoke as if no one was recording. They listed each step, from switching out ingredients, subtly pushing away loyal customers, to cutting work hours so employees would grow frustrated and leave. Mark even bragged about having a shell company ready to acquire Sweet Bloom under a different name. Once the contract is signed, the entire brand will be ours. Carter won't see it coming. Diana pretended to take notes, but inside she knew the evidence was perfect. At that exact moment, a knock sounded at the door. All four people turned to look, and as the door opened, Michael Carter stepped in. His back was straight, his eyes sharp. He was no longer the confused old man buying pastries at the start of the week. He was the founder, the true owner of Sweet Bloom. Mark went pale. Stephen froze like a statue. Michael gave a faint smile, then spoke clearly. I hear you two have quite a bold business plan. As it happens, I'm very interested in the future of my bakery. I can speak. The room felt frozen in time. Michael pulled out a chair and sat at the table. He looked at the two men, now drenched in cold sweat, and calmly placed a USB drive on the table. I've heard enough. And I'm not the only one. He turned to Diana. The lawyer pulled out a folder, a compiled file of evidence, audio recordings, financial document copies, and footage from the hidden cameras. Every dishonest act, every word they spoke, now officially documented. Even the transfer scheme through the shell company has been fully recorded, Diana said coldly. Everything you've admitted to was legally captured. Mark stammered. You can't do this. Michael leaned forward, locking eyes with them. I spent my life building Sweet Bloom, starting with my mother's very first recipe. You really thought I'd let two greedy men destroy it in silence. An hour later, Mark and Stephen left the bakery with termination letters in hand, escorted by two security personnel Michael had hired in advance. Employees and customers alike were stunned, but once Michael revealed the truth, a round of applause filled the bakery. Some people shed tears. Others let out a sigh of relief. Maggie took Michael's hand, her eyes misty. We saved it, Michael. Leo walked over from the counter and said quietly, I never doubted you. You did the right thing. Michael looked around the bakery, now bright and warm, just like it had been on opening day. He knew a new chapter was beginning, but this time there would be no room for betrayal. To be continued. The journey to revive Sweet Bloom begins with bold changes, decisive moves, and a renewed promise from Michael Carter to the community. Since that fateful day, the atmosphere inside Sweet Bloom Bakery felt completely renewed. The scowls were gone. No more sighs from employees whose hours had been slashed. No more disappointed customers leaving in silence. Every morning from the crack of dawn, the scent of butter, cinnamon, and pure vanilla once again drifted down the quiet street. People began to say Sweet Bloom had finally woken up from a long nightmare, and the one who awakened it was Michael Carter. Michael stood at the register next to Leo, the young man who had once had his hours cut simply for speaking the truth. Together, they greeted customers with warm, genuine smiles, nothing forced or scripted. In the back, Maggie, the woman with flour-covered hands and a heart full of passion, was leading the baking process once again, using the original recipes. No margarine, use real butter, no artificial coloring, real vanilla, nothing fake. No one objected. Everyone understood this was the time to rebuild. That evening, Michael called all the staff into a special meeting. He didn't sit above them and didn't give a long speech. He simply said, "I owe you all an apology and a promise. We're not just going to make great pastries, we're going to rebuild trust. From today on, everything in this bakery will be transparent, from the ingredients to every single dollar in tips." Michael, along with longtime accountant Sarah, reviewed every supplier contract. They cut ties with companies that had been cutting corners under the direction of Mark and Stephen. He personally reached out to the original vendors, those who once provided Belgian chocolate, organic cream, and farm-fresh eggs, and brought them back. The costs would certainly be higher, but Michael made it clear, customers don't come here for a cheap pastry. They come to feel something real. One of the first changes was the customer feedback system. For a long time, it had become a formality. Comments were ignored or fake replies were sent. Now, Michael personally reads every single review. One day, Mrs. Gonzalez, the loyal customer who had once been mistreated by Stephen, returned. She hesitated at the door, holding her old, worn-out loyalty card. Michael walked over and gently said, "Mrs. Gonzalez, I'm sorry and thank you for coming back. Today, the blueberry muffin is on me." Her eyes welled up with tears, as if the warm memories of the past had come back to life in the scent of freshly baked goods. Michael understood great pastries alone weren't enough. Sweet Bloom had once been a part of the neighborhood, a place people came not just to eat, but to feel a sense of belonging. So he launched Friday Gatherings, a weekly event where customers could taste new items, give feedback, and simply talk. Maggie was given full freedom to experiment with new creations. She lit up like a child returning to her childhood kitchen. Soon, pastries like Cocoa Joy and Just Like Mom Used to Make began appearing on the shelves and sold out every morning. Tips were now distributed transparently and publicly. Michael even added an extra 10% each day as a form of ethical profit. Former employees, those who had quit under pressure, started to return. They spread the story of the bakery's revival like a small miracle. Longtime customers came back, even those who had once sworn they'd never return. And something no one expected happened. Revenue began to rise despite prices staying the same or even increasing for some items. But in return, customers got quality, respect, and a genuine experience. That weekend, after the bakery had closed, Michael sat alone by the counter. In his hands was an old notebook, still bearing his mother's handwriting, the woman who founded Sweet Bloom. It read, "Pastries are part of it. Heart is everything." He smiled. Though he had once lost trust, he had gained it all back through listening, kindness, and an unshakable refusal to tolerate what was wrong. To be continued. Impressive numbers, a rapid recovery, and the lesson Michael Carter offers to anyone who ever thought kindness was weak. 3 months had passed since the day Michael Carter exposed the two traitors in front of his entire staff and loyal customers. 3 months, just enough time for a bakery once teetering on the edge of closure to become an inspiring story for the whole neighborhood. And even beyond. Sweet Bloom wasn't just saved, it had become a symbol. On the first Monday morning of the new month, Diana, Michael's lawyer and strategic advisor, arrived with a thick stack of documents. "The quarter's report. You'll want to see it," she said with a smile, placing it on the counter. Michael raised an eyebrow and flipped through the pages. With every turn, his face lit up more. Revenue was up 43% compared to the same period last year. The customer return rate had doubled. Loyalty card sign-ups had increased by over 150% in just 6 weeks. But what made him happiest? Over 80% of customer feedback now included 5-star ratings, along with messages of gratitude and sometimes even heartfelt stories. One father wrote, "My daughter wants to come back to Sweet Bloom every Saturday morning again, just like when her mom was still with us." A young woman shared, "I stopped taking sleeping pills after I started working here." Michael nodded gently. "It's not about the numbers. It's the feeling that we're doing something right." That morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, Michael spotted a familiar face across the street. Dark, the man who once tried to take over Sweet Bloom, stood silently, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the bakery. Inside, customers were laughing and chatting. Fresh pastries came out of the oven non-stop, and Leo was teaching a new staff member how to wrap the pastries just right. Outside, Mark quietly turned away. He looked thinner now, his back slightly hunched. Urban Bake, the bakery he had opened 4 blocks away, had shut down just 6 weeks after opening. No one came. The community didn't forget. Michael watched him go, saying nothing. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. But he carried no hatred, only the lesson. One day, Leo asked Michael, "How do you know what to change and what to keep?" Michael smiled and pointed to his heart. "Listen here. Don't listen to the numbers. Customers aren't buying pastries, they're buying the feeling of being valued." That's why Sweet Bloom now offers more than just baked goods. A free book-sharing corner, a monthly pastry story shared by staff members, a small fund to support underprivileged students in the neighborhood. Not a business strategy, just the way Michael lived, and the way he taught others to work. Maggie is now the operations manager, her hair neatly tied up, a clipboard always in hand. Everyone respects her, not just for her years of experience, but for heart she doesn't lead by shouting. She speaks just enough, leads by example, and the staff follow. Leo is studying business management at night on a full scholarship from Sweet Bloom. "I want to open a bakery like this someday," he said with a smile, "but in a place where no one knows me, to see if I can really do it." Michael replied without a hint of humor, "Here you're ready, I'll be your first customer." One late afternoon, after everyone had gone home, Michael took out an old yellowed piece of paper, his mother's handwritten original business plan. He placed it in a glass frame and hung it on the wall, right behind the counter. Anyone who walked in could read. Bakery is not just a place that sells food. It's a place that preserves memories, heals hearts, and starts beautiful new mornings. If you've read this far, chances are you're not just interested in a story of a comeback. Maybe you're searching for something more, a bit of faith in people, in kindness, in the belief that doing the right thing is always worth it. Michael Carter, the 60-year-old bakery owner who once disguised himself as a customer to save his mother's shop, has proven one thing: kindness is not weakness. Listening is not incompetent, and decency will always be the most sustainable recipe for success. Want to hear more real stories like this? Subscribe to our channel and each week be inspired by people quietly making a difference. Sweet Bloom came back to life. Now, the question is, are you ready to begin yours? Sweet Bloom came back to life not just through butter and flour, but through belief, sincerity, and a heart that refused to give up. Michael Carter, at 60 years old, didn't just save his mother's bakery. He achieved something simple yet profound. Kindness is not weakness, and listening is never the wrong path. If you're feeling tired, disheartened, or like the world has grown too cold, remember it only takes one person to stand up with kindness, with truth, and everything can change. And maybe, just maybe, that person is you.